Good morning. You listen to FloorDaily.net, and I'm Kemp Harr. This morning, my guest is Kermit Baker, a Harvard economist and the chief economist with the American Institute of Architecture. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Kemp. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you get a little snow in Boston today, huh?
We're starting to finally get winter. You know, we missed it for the first 2 months of the year. We're starting to see a few storms come in here in March.
Well, let's talk about this Billings Index because it took a little bit of a dip in January after a nice reading in December. I guess it went to 49.5. Most people should know that if it's below 50, that means that there's less billing going on. Let me just ask you before you comment on that, do you factor in the number of billing days?
We do. What we do, Kemp, akin to that is sort of a seasonal adjustment. So we December, for example, is a very lean month for billings at architecture firms because of other things going around, and so we adjust that up to what it normally is. And in January, generally a stronger month, so we adjust that down for what it normally is. So we try to factor all those issues in to make sure that it really is comparable to the other months in prior years.
In your press release, you said that this little dip was not a cause for concern, right?
Well, I don't think it's a cause for concern. I mean, we'll continue to monitor it. I think we're at the stage in the cycle where growth is getting slower. When is it going to tip over the edge? When are we going to start seeing more regular declines in billings at architecture firms? I certainly don't think we're there yet, but I think that's really what we've got our eye on. Are we going to see an extended series of months where we see architecture firms report reduced billings? As you mentioned, January was a very modest minor. You mentioned the December number was one of the strongest monthly readings we've seen in years. So, I think a little bit of just sort of, catching up to the trend is what we're seeing in January relative to a really strong kick to the end of 2016. And the other things that we track, in addition to national billings, are inquiries for new projects and new design work coming into architecture firms. So our billings are kind of work that they're finishing up, and we track it a little bit earlier in the process, what they're hearing about new projects that might be happening over the next year or two, as well as new work that's just starting up at firms. And both of those in January, the inquiries and the new design contracts were very strong numbers. Both of them were up for January relative to December levels. So that's why I think we're not too concerned about this modest dip in billings in January, particularly if we don't see the February and March numbers continue that trend.
All right, well, let me read between the lines on what you're saying here, because it sounds to me like you're expecting later in the year potentially a little bit of a dip, and I'm curious as is it because this bull market is in 8 years, or because like you said in your last release, the new inquiries went to 60 from 57.6. So what makes you think there might be a tail off on the growth?
Well, and I wouldn't say later this year, but I think clearly, Kemp, we're on the downside of this cycle. I think the whole non-residential market is going to see slower growth in 2017 than it saw in 2016, and likely again in 18 to see slower growth in 18 than it did in 17. And we're just tracking it down. I mean, you talked about this 8-year cycle, and the construction cycle has been a bit shorter. It didn't start till later. But we have seen over the last several years very strong numbers on the commercial side, offices, stores, hotels, things like that. They're starting to slow down pretty dramatically. We've seen a really sharp slowdown in multifamily construction, sort of the first piece in this sector. We still got strong numbers coming out of the institutional side, healthcare, education, government facilities, but we're rolling along on this cycle. Some pieces have clearly peaked and are heading down. Others are beginning to peak and head down, and others we think will peak later this year, early next year. So we're rolling down this cycle. I think we have very limited opportunity for a strong acceleration in the market before we wind down this cycle. But on the other hand, I don't think anything is imminent in terms of a decline.
Oh, well, let me just ask you, because one of the questions that jumps into mind, you look at where the stock market is today, and you hear about the potential in August of this new administration giving some corporate tax breaks, which will probably take a long time to pass. Could that change the cycle or not?
Well, I think it could extend it, and I think we've already seen it extended. We certainly had a very strong run-up in stock prices right after the election. I think that's giving more momentum to our economy. We're in a bit of a pause now. I think investors are taking stock of where we're going after the sort of initial surge. And I think you're right that, how policies play out at the federal level could certainly affect the economic outlook, both on the upside and the downside. I think tax reform that you mentioned is likely a pretty strong plus. Rolling back regulations, I think, would be viewed by investors as a pretty strong plus. I think there's sort of equal concern on the downside for trade and immigration policy. Those are likely to hurt our economy. So, I think we'll have to wait and see sort of what percolates up, how the different policies are taking form, and how that'll affect the outlook for the economy.
Yeah, as we look at what's going on in the EU, certainly not great news over there with Brexit and everything, so that would certainly give us a cold as well, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We rely very, very, very heavily on trade to support our economy. Particularly some of the better-paying jobs in the economy are sort of trade-based. So what happens in the EU, what happens in China, what happens really across the world is going to affect the health of our economy.
Okay, let's jump. You wear another hat. You're an advisor economist with the Joint Center of Housing Studies, and you track home improvement spending, and your latest news release said it was going to be strong and stable in 17, expecting growth at around 6.7. My quick question there is that you forecasted 6.9 in 16, so that's actually a slight little dip, or is it?
Well, it's slightly slower growth rate. I don't know that anyone in this industry would be too concerned about 6.7% growth. And we're also predicting that this will be it looks like 2017 is fifth year in a row of above trend growth in this industry. So we've seen a nice little ride here, coming out of this recession and the pause we saw right after the recession, and now we're kind of catching up for that. This is an industry that averages about 5% growth, or has averaged that over the last 20 years. So, we're now seeing some of that payback from the leaner years, and like I say, I think a good healthy run. I think this industry is probably much better off at 6-7% growth than it would be at 12-14% growth, given the labor issues we have in the industry, given the concern about inflation and materials prices and things like that. Good, healthy, mid-single digit, upper single digit growth, I think, is the sweet spot for this industry.
Do you think it's going to taper off toward the second part of the year?
We see the year pretty much stable growth in this sort of 6.5-7% range for the year. So we're not predicting any significant slowing. I mean, the things that are really driving this, what we look for leading indicators of home improvement activity, are number one, sales of existing homes. So if mortgage rates started to shoot up, that would slow it down. But I think at current levels, they could certainly support a lot of growth. And the other is just sort of the general construction industry, kind of just remodeling tends to track pretty closely with new home building. They're kind of both driven by the same thing, job growth, income growth, and things like that. And the single-family housing market looks to have a lot of strength behind it. It's just been so slow in recovering. Most folks are calling for about 10% growth in single-family home building this year. So, I think we've got two elements that traditionally have been very highly correlated with home improvement spending that both look like they're going to have good, solid years in 2017.
All right. So to summarize, it looks like a sunny day for most of 17, right?
Yeah, no, I think 17 is shaping up as a really good year. As we talked about, Kemp, I think there probably are a few more risks on the downside than the upside. Not a lot of things. We talked about a few. Not a lot of things that could make the year better than we expect, and unfortunately, a longer list of things that could make the year a little bit worse than expected. But I think our betting now is for good, healthy growth for the year.
All right, Kermit. Well, appreciate your update. It's good to talk to you as always. Again, been talking to Kermit Baker, a Harvard economist, and you've been listening to Kemp Harr and FloorDaily.net.